Hi, my name is David Bose. I am the Communications and Marketing Director for Washington Policy Center, and this is Washington Policy on the Go, where we talk with center directors, get the latest on state policy and analysis, and we get you up to date during this lunchtime event. And we go into depth on issues on a regular basis. We usually talk to two or three center directors. Today, we'll talk with two. We'll talk with Todd Myers. He is our Center for the Environment Director about the governor's trip to Scotland and his special expenses that other governors did not incur, and what could have taken place with the amount of money that our governor spent versus what the other governors spent in getting to Scotland. So we'll talk about that coming up, plus a spokesman review column hitting at Todd, slamming Todd and Washington Policy Center for supposed whoppers, and yet in the same issue, vindicating Todd. We'll share that and reveal that somewhat ironic and funny story coming up as well. We'll also speak first with Elizabeth Hovde. She is the director for our Center for Healthcare and the director of our Center for Workers' Rights, which I think is, we'll talk with her about the governor's speech at Crosscut over the weekend, where the governor talked about his record, what he sees as a record of success over the past few years, and the continuing state of emergency. Before we get to Elizabeth, though, I did want to point you to our blog at washingtonpolicy.org and our publications list there. Maria Frost has a great scoop about the Washington State ferry system. She took a look at some emails thanks to some public records requests, and it shows that there was some pretty dramatic, and that's their words, dramatic reductions to the state ferry service. In public, they were not described in that way. But in private, these cuts to the ferry service were described as dramatic, and they were done in order to minimize the impact of the firings that took place for those that did not want to get vaccinated. It's a really fascinating piece, and I would urge you to take a look at that because it shows kind of behind the scenes some moves that were made in curbing service in order to minimize the political impact of the governor's supposed emergency moves. So it's well worth the read. She was going to be able to speak with us today, but she ran into some other project deadlines and could not. So I would urge you to check that out, washingtonpolicy.org, and make sure you share that with your friends and on social media as well. You can also catch it on our website or on our social media sites on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram as well. Now let's turn to Elizabeth Hovde. She is a director for our Center for Worker Rights and our Center for Healthcare. She was watching the governor's speech at Crosscut, earning, I think, hazard pay for watching the Crosscut Festival this year, particularly. It was a kind of a who's who of some pretty interesting and varied speakers, but the governor arrives and he's proclaiming himself a real victor in the war against COVID. Elizabeth, why don't you describe for us what it is that you heard from the governor that didn't quite that didn't fit with you? That I know you went on a tweet storm during the governor's speech, but what was the first thing that jumped out at you in how the governor was presenting his case?
I'm a good substitute for Maria today because this is so related. It is constant taking credit for lower death counts in our state, and there is no proof for this. In fact, today we still remain in 5th place for the lowest death counts among the nation, which is fantastic. But, there's a whole host of reasons for that. And the governor keeps trying to claim it's his decisions and his mandates. And there are 2 states beating us that never had vaccine mandates on employment. And there are 2 more states beating us that had a testing requirement or vaccine mandate in place for a while. So there's no way to prove that a vaccine mandate is saving 19,000 lives, which is what he kept saying over and over. And the other thing claiming that doesn't do is take into the account that the vast majority of people dying from or with COVID are elderly people outside of their working years. This is not a policy that is helping us in any way. It's hurting family budgets, it's hurting public services, and there's just constant spin, like Maria found with the ferry department and transportation, back to the snowplow stuff too, that this is working for us when it's not. You can contract or spread COVID, whether you're vaccinated or not. It is having an impact on hospitalizations and deaths we see, but carrying the day that your vaccine mandate is helping the state rather than hurting it, and is to credit for 19,000 lives. And he's comparing it, by the way, to the worst state in the nation, Mississippi. So that's interesting too, in my opinion, that you would pick the very worst one to stop or to claim credit for lower death rates.
Was there any pushback at Crosscut? I mean, Crosscut's an organization, for those of you who don't know, an organization of journalists. They kind of banded together as other publications like the Seattle PI went out of business. New ventures have started up, and Crosscut's a source of Northwest news. Was there any pushback on the governor for things like, hey, you're claiming that you've got the lower death rate because of these actions, but there's 2 states ahead of you that didn't do these things? How do you make the claim that your actions are responsible for this if these other states did just as well or better without taking those drastic actions?
Bill Radke was the interviewer, and he did a great job. He was in touch with us too, and had looked at our research and actually asked the governor just that, with these 2 states beating us in the death rate, how do you prove this? And the governor is very good at taking it back to, I've saved 19,000 lives, and it's because of my decisions that we are here. He also took great long sentences to explain how he hopes no other governor ever has to make the hard decisions he had to make, and that he's really proud of those decisions, that he has been able to save this many lives in our state. With his, and here's the thing, do vaccines save lives? Right now it looks that way. That's what the data is showing us, that there's fewer deaths. Does the vaccine mandate save lives? Unemployment, which is not the population even dying in great numbers. It's just a misconnect. He's hoping people don't connect the dots, and that he can keep this vaccine mandate on employment going when it is not justifiable.
Well, there's an interesting, it's hard to get politicians to walk back a policy, but there's also, you can say something saves life. Like, I'm fully vaccinated because I look at it and I think I wanted to reduce my odds. I've got a couple of factors, and then I thought, I've got, a bunch of kids relying on me, so I'm not too keen on taking a risk I don't have to. And, I've got plenty of friends and family members that aren't so keen on it and refused vaccination as well. But, I look at it as, you make your choice, and then, you roll the dice there. But one of the things that keeps popping up in social circles and in public circles and conversations I've had is that people assume that, or they're talking as though making the vaccination mandate is the same as stopping the spread, because they're assuming that the vaccination makes it so that you're not contracting or spreading the disease. And it's a strange thing, because I've had these conversations a number of times. I'm by no means an expert on any of those things, but I keep saying, you can read the paper, you can read the CDC, you can read all these things, and that's it. The spread still occurs if you're vaccinated or not. So, as you point out, in terms of employment and other things, how do they account if you're dealing with a population that's the most endangered population is not the employable population. It's people who are past their employment years and they're retired. There might be, some exceptions to that rule, of course, but, and vulnerable populations. But as far as the employment, the body of people that are generally employed, that's the vaccines aren't stopping that spread. And so, was there any acknowledgement of that on the governor? Was there any hint that he might back away from the vaccine mandate like the governor of Oregon has.
Nope, it has helped save 19,000 lives, and that was repeated and reiterated that the time to stop the vaccine mandate is not now because of the outcomes he's seen. And I'm at the same place you're at. I'm vaccinated for the same reasons. I travel some, I have kids. My age isn't pretty, my age helped convince me to do this. But there's risk either way. And that's what we're arguing for, is for people to be able to make patient-centered health decisions, balancing all the risks that are out there. It's really hard to justify a policy that takes away a person's livelihood, but does not stop the contraction or spread of COVID-19. COVID-19 is mean. It gets some of us and it doesn't get others of us. My whole immediate family is vaccinated. Most of us, I haven't gotten COVID yet, but most of us have had COVID. It's a mean disease. It gets people. And one can argue the policy is actually hurting workplaces, not helping them, as it's pitting workers against each other. You're losing out on public services, and the vaccinated are left to work through staffing shortages, which is not their favorite thing to do either. There is no justification for a mandate that cannot, where the vaccination cannot stop the spread or contraction of COVID. And it's fascinating to me that it continues. I don't understand the lack of acknowledging that this helps us. If there's a case to be made for hospital resources, I could see going down that hole. The vaccine is showing to protect people from hospitalization and death, we think. The jury's still out, but that's the way it's trending toward. And if you wanted to argue that, my argument is you need to have a non-discriminatory policy that helps address that. If you can't just discriminate against some workers, some state employees who can contract and spread COVID, while not having a mandate on the other people who can contract and spread COVID. We can all do that. So it's time to lift these mandates. It's discriminatory, it's punitive. There's no justification.
Yeah, I mean, if the justification is, you can contract and spread, and this isn't changing those items, then it becomes, okay, so the real reason that you're doing this, if it's not that, and we've proven it's not that, by we, I'm not talking WPC, I'm talking about as a society at large.
Right.
There's other reasons going on here, and among them there appears to be, or it reeks of political retribution. I'm angry at you because you did not agree with me, therefore we're punishing this group of people because they disagreed with me.
And it's not only resulted in fewer public services being met, there's an ostracization going on among society's people where you're pitting these people against each other, and the vaccine mandate is fueling that, I think. Well,
the political discrimination is illegal in Seattle, at least. I'm not sure statewide, but in Seattle it was for a time. So that would be an interesting argument to see. Elizabeth, thank you so much. We'll get to the Q&A section here coming up. And for those of you watching, you can ask your question at any time. Just enter it into the Q&A box, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. Try to use the Q&A instead of the chat box, just because it makes it easier for me to go through and find your questions and get you the answers that you're seeking. All right, now let's turn to Todd Myers. He is our Center for the Environment Director and the subject of a column in the Spokesman Review that, it says, it calls Todd, I actually have it written down, Todd, the various sins of Todd Myers. That Todd Myers tells whoppers and is paid to provide fact-like statements, not facts, but fact-like statements for conservative politicians, and that's what you call research. And then
I would just like to point out that facts are fact-like.
Yeah, that's true.
They're infinitely fact-like.
They're the most fact-like of all the facts out there. And then he calls himself the expert in free market environmental policy, but then everybody else is supposed to be an activist radical. This is among the charges from the Sean Vestal, the left-wing columnist in the Spokesman Review, who spends a good half of the column hitting Todd personally and by name, not providing any instance of where he's been dishonest or any example of false research or false statements, not one. And so half the column is just hitting him on these things or making these assertions. And then you get to the point where he says the real reason for this column is to show the depth of the scientific consensus for removing the lower Snake River dams. And there's a couple of paragraphs about that. Then it goes back to just slamming Todd. So, it's an unusual, it's the second unusual column that I've seen in the Spokesman Review of late that specifically targets Washington Policy Center or Washington Policy Center staff in a manner that is unusual, in that usually editors want to see, your focus is on the facts or your disagreement, it's not on the people, but there seems to be this kind of obsession of going after the people. So now I'll let you have your 2 cents. Todd, how did you feel about your latest love letter from Mr. Vestal?
I think it is evidence that he does right. I mean, the problem is that what Policy Center, what we do is that when people make a claim, we go, oh, do the data back that up? And that people don't like that. So, I mean, the best example of that is that he has a paragraph in there about the work that I've done on snowpack. So in Washington, literally in Washington state law, it says that climate change is causing a decline in snowpack. Okay, we can test that. That is a testable hypothesis. We can look at the data. So that's what I have been doing for the last many years. And what we see is that in fact, snowpack is not declining, that over the last 15, almost 20 years, there have been more years where snowpack is above normal than below by a significant margin. About 3/4 of the years have been above normal snowpack and about a quarter have been below. So on the whole, the trend is upward. And in fact, we see that USDA, who provides the data, it's a government agency, it's not me, actually adjusted what they call normal. They do it every decade. And in most of the snow sheds across the state, they adjusted normal upwards because snowpack has been higher. But state law, ironically, says that the opposite is happening. So I've been pointing out that state law is wrong, that the data, very simple data from the federal government say that that's not true. So Sean has a paragraph where he attacks me for it and then says, as if climate change isn't real, as if this 1 year of good snow proves climate. Well, that's not what I'm claiming at all. And I think what happens with Sean is that he doesn't actually read my stuff. He sees something and then he gets really mad and then he reacts without reading it closely. Because my argument is the literal opposite, which is his friends and the environmental activists he supports are the one making claims about the relationship between snowpack and climate change. And it's wrong. And the data say very clearly it's wrong, but he can't deal with that. And so he gets it all muddled up and he knows he's angry at me. And so he writes this angry paragraph about how I'm wrong because of snowpack and climate change or something. And that's kind of his whole piece.
And this has been a problem with some of the more radical elements of the environmental left, or just, the capital L left. And I suppose there's probably examples on the other side as well. But, in this case, you have a comment that you're making that says, look, you're making this assertion doesn't make sense. And they're just angry that you've shown them data that doesn't fit with their worldview. Right. You're not saying that their worldview is wrong in absolute terms. You're saying what you're saying here is wrong, and it forces people to have a real discussion about what the reality is in terms of signs for climate change, or what you might have to get into trade-offs. Just because you say something is for the climate doesn't make it a good policy. So you have to start talking about it. and that upsets people. If you're if you know, think about it like a religion or something. If it's, you know, it's not allowed. You know, this is kind of a worldview where no one's allowed to challenge you, no one's allowed to challenge your belief system, and no one's allowed to challenge your assertions about the implications of those beliefs. Because he wrote, you know, that you write these posts about record snowpack in terms of climate change policy because existence of snow is considered a zingy rejoinder to irrefutable evidence of a warming planet. You know, when, you know, as you point out, you're writing because they've said that this is evidence of the warming planet. It's not actually happening. Therefore, you know, you should either stop writing it. You know, that would be one thing for sure. But it's certainly not evidence of warming planet if it's not happening. You know,
well, but we can measure if we want to show that there's a warming planet.
Yeah,
there's a metric. There's something that you can measure. It's called temperature.
Right.
We measure temperature in a variety of different ways. We have satellite-based system, we have land-based system, and we can measure it. And guess what? We see that temperature is rising. You don't need snowpack to show that temperature is rising. Okay, so that's fine. The reason that people, alarmists, and I won't just say people on the left, because there's a lot of people on the left who are very good on these issues, and frankly, who work with us. Some of you who even contributes to the Washington Policy Center, which is the irony. But there are some alarmists who use issues like snowpack and other things like that to say this is a climate crisis and we don't have time to think, we just have to act and just do what I want because we're losing our snowpack. That's why they say, that's why they make these claims. They don't make these claims to prove that temperature is increasing. We don't need to measure to snowpack to see whether temperature is increasing. We can measure temperature. The reason that they do snowpack and the reason they make these other claims is to put us in a crisis mentality so that they can get the policies they want without and challenge anyone who says these things don't work simply by saying, look, we're all going to die if we don't act. And they don't. And when you say, but the data very clearly show you are wrong, they don't like that because it gets people into a more thoughtful approach rather and takes them out of a crisis mentality.
Yeah, and they've got the fear-based approach. And by the way, as I was pointing out, it's a subset of the left, and it's large. I mean, look, the governor does this all the time with his crisis approach, and so it's not insignificant.
Well, the governor said that Seattle is on its way to 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Right. There is literally no science whatsoever that says anything close to that. And yet it gets reported without anybody saying, by the way, this is nonsense. But again, it is part of that crisis mentality.
Yeah, and I'd point out that people who are on the left, or I've always hated that because it's an imprecise political tool, but it's shorthand and people understand it. But people on the left who do say, hey, look, you know, they would say the data supports what Todd's saying, or this data does not, this is not a climate change event. This is, you know, an extreme weather event, unrelated. They're often targeted for interfering with creating the crisis mentality also. I mean, it's you know, it's a destructive method. It's a way of preempting political discourse instead of actually having it. You know, is you know, kind of setting these standards and then not letting anyone challenge them, regardless of what the data is, because your overall agenda is so important that it shouldn't be talked about or debated or challenged in any way. There was another area where you were challenged, Todd, and that was where he claimed you invented statistics about pandemic restrictions, claiming that for every 2 people who died in Washington from COVID, 1 died from pandemic restrictions. Now, we've talked about your, you know, excessive deaths writings here on Washington Policy on the Go in a previous episode, but why don't you recap that for us? Because it seemed like you covered it pretty well and explained it using, again, government data in your original publication.
So the analysis I did, so initially there were people who were, in 2020, there were people who were skeptical that COVID was killing as many people as was claimed. And the easy way and a way to test that, right? Okay, are we actually seeing COVID deaths? Are these people who are dying who would have died anyway otherwise, or is it not as serious? Is to look at excess deaths, right? So the total number of deaths follows a very similar pattern: high in the winter, low in the summer, and then high in the winter. It's a sort of this U shape over the course of the year. And if you look at the averages of 2016, 2017 to 2018, the lines are almost on top of each other. So it's very similar every year in the nation and in Washington state about how many people die and when they die. What you saw in 2020 was all of a sudden in the spring, a big spike up in the number of total deaths. So that includes COVID and non-COVID deaths. So that doesn't prove that all those people died from COVID, but something very dramatic happened because you saw a big spike and you saw levels of death that were higher than normal. So I use that to say, look, this COVID is real. It's really killing people. But then what I did is I took the next step in 2021 to say, okay, how many of those deaths above normal, right? Here's the normal level. Here's what we're seeing. How many of those deaths are COVID deaths? And what I found is that about 2/3 of them were COVID deaths using CDC data, but 1/3 were not COVID. So something's going on there. And in fact, in late 2021, the second half, it was basically 1-to-1. For every COVID excess death, you were getting a non-COVID excess death. And so what I argued is that those are related to the pandemic restrictions. Now, I want to be clear, and I wish I'd been clear, a little bit clearer. I will admit that I wish I'd been a little bit clearer. I do say that this is both government and social restrictions. So people were fearful because they didn't know what to do. And so they chose not to go to the doctor when they should have, or did other things that caused them that weren't, Jay Inslee saying you can't do this, but it was the fear, it was the sort of the whole everything around COVID that made people change behavior, which had an adverse impact on them. That's part of it. But I think it is very clear that the restrictions also had an impact because there are more restrictions on hospitals and when you can go, and the governor actually stopped a bunch of surgeries and things like that. In my own family, I had a situation where my dad had a surgery and he was stopped from getting it done, and they were going to keep him on opioid pain pills. Fortunately, we got that changed, but that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing to have somebody just sort of waiting and be on opioid pain pills. Seattle Times has done a nice story about this, where the numbers of what they call deaths of despair skyrocketed. We know this is occurring. Sean doesn't like that because he wants this strong lockdowns. He thinks that undermining, the government authority in this area is bad, and pointing out that there are costs to these rules undermines the COVID restrictions. So he just doesn't want to hear any of it. So he sent me an email and said, nobody can figure out where you're getting your data. Nobody. I've talked to epidemiologists in the State Department of Health, but nobody can figure out where you're getting your data. So I sent him the link. It was the Centers for Disease Control. It's the federal government, CDC. Now, when he responded, what he said was, well, you didn't answer my question. Well, I did answer your question. He's like, no. I want to know why you're making these claims. Well, so he shifted, right? I mean, having realized that actually my data were bulletproof and from the federal government, he had to change. So the reason he has this very vague paragraph about unnamed epidemiologists having unnamed concerns about my data is because he can't explain who said it, and he can't explain what they said because he knows that my data are bulletproof. And that if he was more specific, it would reveal how sort of temperamental his argument rather than data-based.
It's interesting that it fits in with the other thing, though, because it's still about keeping the crisis mentality, where you don't question that authority, which that's not it hasn't been a traditional liberal approach. I mean, George Orwell was was very liberal, but he was big on questioning authority, and we're kind of losing that in some sectors here.
Along those lines, who did he ask, right? I know who he asked. He asked Spokane County and the State Department of Health. So he says, Todd Myers' data says that your policies had negative consequences. Do you agree or disagree? And shockingly, they disagreed, right? Of course, they're going to say, no, our policies were awesome. We didn't have any negative consequences, right? They have a very strong incentive to say that. But the reason he has to be vague is because it's very clear that they have a strong incentive to deny the impact of their own policies and that their arguments in defense of themselves are weak.
Can I jump in here a second, Dave?
Yeah, go ahead, Elizabeth.
Sorry. You know, it's the same, this all is rolled together, and, you know, sometimes the numbers and the data are not showing us what we want to see. We are hearing from the state over and over and over on our highway signs and speeches and interviews that getting boosted is the safest thing you can do. And I'm looking at King County government numbers right now that show the cases contracted of COVID. And in the lower years, up until 30, the people who are boosted are getting COVID more often than the people who are not boosted. So it's a very interesting thing. And then it switches after 30, and the people who are boosted are contracting it less than the people who are just fully vaccinated. So, but instead of talking about this and pointing out the differences, and we don't know what this means yet, but this is what the numbers are showing, you're not allowed to say anything about the numbers showing anything outside of what we're wanting to say.
It could, I mean, and for instance, what that could be simply is that people in their 20s who get boosted then feel bulletproof and invisible.
Exactly.
Because there has been a narrative that says that if you get vaccinated, your chance of contraction is lower. And we know that's not true.
Right.
As you said, Elizabeth, vaccines are very good at reducing hospitalization and death. I got vaccinated literally the first day it was available to me because I believe in the vaccines and I think the data show, but the data do not show that they prevent contraction. But since we have told people, or at least insinuated, that vaccines prevent contraction, what you get are some people who say, well, I'm boosted, so I can do whatever I want. And that's the wrong message. And the data that you're showing indicate that message may be having a negative consequence. We have to talk about that.
Yeah. And that was my take as well. Risk. If you don't think that there's the risk, you're you're just going to go out and do risky things because you don't have the same consequence. You know,
last summer when we already knew that people could contract or spread if you had COVID and all these vaccine mandates and things were being talked about, I'm on a sporting team, and the sporting team decided to let go of anyone who wasn't vaccinated in the fall. And despite what we knew, and the people who were vaccinated were then unmasking and just living life like normal. I mean, it really is a mental thing where if you're vaccinated, you felt free to go about the country, move about the country. So all those things play into these numbers, and we have to recognize that people are getting COVID because we gather, not because we're vaccinated or unvaccinated.
It's a sad thing when people kind of, there's been, grandparents left without visitors. There's been, unemployment that's unnecessary. There's been a lot of human suffering that's unnecessary. And a reasoned policy debate is always better. I like you, Todd. The first day I was eligible, I was in because I just said, you know what, you can jab me about 19 times. Doesn't matter if you can reduce the odds. I've never been overly keen on colds in general, much less a super cold. But back to what was supposedly the primary purpose of the column against you, which was the Lower Snake River dams. This is the last comment I'll have on this because I don't want to spend all our time on the love letter to Todd and the Spokesman Review. But there was a line there about the salmon recovery where you have. Anyone who disagrees with you is supposed to be a liar. but you're the one who's ignoring all the science. And then he goes with this list of science, which I'm sure you'll poke holes in just a moment. But my favorite part personally was, I was made aware this morning that in the same edition of the Spokesman Review in the local news section, there was a headline about the unexpected and better, I should say better than expected, salmon recovery in the lower Snake River, and how there's so many. The headline was Springer's back in best numbers since 2016. And this is published originally in the Lewiston Tribune, but it's in the Spokesman Review the same day that this column is against you, saying what a horrible anti-science guy you are. And then they have this little story in the back about the better than expected returns of salmon, so good that they might even open it up to some adult fish harvesting, upriver. I mean, you just can't ask for something. On the opinion page, you're a demon. On the news page, you're totally vindicated.
So, yeah, what he does in the second half is he says, oh, all the science is on my side. And he lists what he calls science. But what he lists is not science. He lists a letter from people from 1999, 23 years ago. He lists a couple of editorials in newspapers written by people who were fish biologists, but they're editorials, they're not science. He also lists a economic analysis, and the economic analysis is based on a public opinion poll, which is not science. It's an economic analysis, and it's not based on data, it's based on a public opinion poll. The irony is that the economic analysis is written by a friend of mine who I very much like. And he and I went out to lunch and have talked about this. And I am pretty sure that he would say that while he disagrees with me, he appreciates my critiques of it. So it's like you're actually citing data or analyses from people who like me. So I thought that was ironic, but none of those are science, right? They're all opinions. They may be based on science, or they may have elements of science to make their arguments, but at the end of the day, they are opinions. There's two things about that. The first is that he ignored the single most comprehensive scientific analysis of Snake River dams, which was finished in 2020 by the federal scientific agencies, thousands of pages, thousands of citations of data and science that said we should keep the dams. So the only thing that he ignores literally the most recent and most comprehensive scientific analysis of the dams that disagrees with him, and instead citing letters from 23 years ago. The second thing, though, is the basis of science is a testable hypothesis backed by data. So if you say, here is what I claim, and this is what I'm claiming my hypothesis is, then they say, okay, great, now go get the data and we'll test whether that is true. He doesn't cite any data, and he actually ignores the data. All of the claims that are made in these letters from 23 years ago are that salmon are going to go extinct. Okay, is that happening? We can test it. I can tell you how many salmon passed the Snake River dams yesterday. We have that data. And what do they show? That the populations are going up. And that was the article that you alluded to, which is not only were the populations predicted to go up, they're actually higher than where the predictions are so far this year. Now, it's a little bit early, but that's what the projections are, is that it's going to be even better than expected. So, look, I'm willing to test the hypothesis. I claimed last year that populations would go up, and guess what? They went up. And I claimed that they would go up again this year. And I offered Sean, all right, let's bet. Let's test. You claim they're declining. I claim they're increasing. Let's test that hypothesis. And he refuses because he would rather have rhetoric than a testable hypothesis and data. That's what science is. And if a scientist says, I know I'm right, but I refuse to allow you to test my hypothesis, is absurd, right? It is not science. You would obviously see that that's just pure nonsense. But that's what Sean and a lot of people who want to destroy the dams are doing. They refuse to actually look at the data and instead say, I have this analysis from 20 years ago that says we're in trouble.
This is one of my favorite hobbies for when we have internet trolls or social media people or critics of WPC who are particularly harsh on center directors. I'll type up the response online, and it's almost always, this person's lying, this person's mischaracterizing, this person's wrong, and I just do the follow up as WPC, and I'll say, could you please point to where we're wrong on the data, or because I know the center directors would like to correct their paper if you have that available. So please tell us specifically where this is wrong so that we can get it corrected as soon as possible and issue the correction. And so far, no one has ever taken me up on any of those offers. It's the crickets chirping, but they're real eager, to slam, not so eager to actually, put forth what it is they believe. Now, before we run out of time, I want to go to what the governor did to get to the Scottish Climate Conference. He brought his wife, and there were some headlines about that because Center Squared revealed the governor spent many thousands of dollars on some business class seats for he and his wife to get to the Scottish Climate Conference. There's some irony there for me because we just came through 2.5 years of pandemic where Zoom is everywhere. Everybody's meeting. They've been conducting business remotely. And yet the climate leaders around the world still have to go to resorts in fancy places with posh hotels and amenities in order to make their case, even though they could technically just sit at a desk and share, everything that they have to share because technology makes that possible, but it's not nearly as fun. So they go and they do these things. What made the governor's expenses, what made them novel, unique in this regard, Todd? And you pointed out what the governor could have done with those expenses. Why don't you explain those things?
So the Center Square reported, based on data provided by the governor's office, that the taxpayers of Washington State paid more than $12,000 for he and the First Lady to fly to Scotland. They also noted that Governor Inslee was the only one who took his wife. All other governors attended, but none of them took their spouse. They also pointed out that he was the only one who rode business class, that all others chose economy or coach or whatever. So here we have the governor spending more than $12,000 on business class for he and his wife. So the question is, okay, it's $12,000 in the grand scheme of things, that's not that much. But here's what it means. We have a governor who's telling us that climate change is literally, and what he says is an existential crisis,
right?
That we are all going to die. Literally, we will all die if we don't address climate change. That's what existential means. And yet, he spends $12,000 on first class tickets to fly. Now, the first thing they said is, well, there is a nonprofit group that invested in carbon offsets to cover the emissions from the flight. Okay, fine. But the irony of that is that Washington State actually severely restricts those same carbon offsets in our upcoming cap and trade law. So what the governor used as sort of a get out of jail free card, his own law restricts in Washington State. But the second is that if he had used that $12,000 on those same carbon offsets that he's citing as sort of a get out of jail free card, he could have offset the CO2 emissions for the entire governor's staff for a year and a half. For every member of his staff in the governor's office for a year and a half, he could have eliminated their CO2 emissions. But instead, he spent it to fly business class for he and his wife. And what that shows is that when push comes to shove, when you were given a choice between public grandstanding and PR, or reducing the CO2 emissions that he says are an existential threat, he chooses PR. And that's what we see again and again with our public policy on climate change. And it's why we're missing our climate targets. We constantly miss our climate targets because the policies and the actions are more about grandstanding than results.
It's interesting that you bring this up because I know some people would say, hey, we're getting nitpicky. There's always, expenses that come up and people like to make a big deal out of them. But as you point out, there's a difference between somebody making an expense and dealing with it versus somebody who says we're in an existential crisis and Seattle's going to get to 130 degrees if we don't do the maximum possible right now. And then they go about, on the jet set crowd and charge it to the taxpayer and pretend it's no big deal, when they could have utilized those taxpayer resources for something more dramatic and a bigger example. Let's get to the Q&A for both Todd and Elizabeth here. Let's start with this question from Kevin. Do you think Jay Inslee's membership in the World Economic Forum impacts his COVID proclamations and declarations?
I haven't looked into that. I think that, we often are like-minded with the organizations we're a part of. And so chicken or egg there, I'm not sure.
Any comment, Todd?
I tend to think that Jay thinks that he actually said that he is literally the only person in Washington that can save lives. So I don't think the World Economic Forum gave him that ego. I think he had that before.
Next question from Hank. Have you won your bet, Todd?
So my bet is, I did bet again that the salmon returns would increase this year on the lower Snake River Dam with the lower Granite Dam Chinook, spring Chinook returns. We have just begun the return, so the results won't be known actually until middle of August is the end of the spring and summer run. So that technically that's the end. Now, if the returns at some point are higher than they were last year, we'll know earlier, but it's still very early. As of Sunday, the returns were literally almost identical to last year. However, the returns at the Ice Harbor Dam, which is the first dam on Snake River, and the Bonneville Dam, which is the first dam on the Columbia, were more than double last year. So the fish are making their way up. They haven't made their way up to the lower Granite Dam yet. As the article that you pointed out that came out yesterday, the Idaho Department of Fish and Game is projecting that their already high projection of salmon returns will actually be even high, that the term returns are better than they expected. So it looks good, but it'll be a while before I find out.
Yeah, and it looked like there was some construction in the dams that was creating a situation where it would hold back the fish a little bit. They just wrapped that up, so it'll be interesting to watch. Next question: have any of the state employees that were let go due to their vaccination status been rehired by the state? Elizabeth.
That's a good question. I thought I remembered seeing something about hiring back some individual workers at some point, but I can't say for sure that happened. And then on Saturday, I saw the governor teasing a way that maybe people would be able to get their job back in certain sectors. So I will definitely follow up and see about that. But in general, no, that's not available. And the mandate is not ending anytime right now.
Next question regarding the dams: 97% of juveniles survive going over, through, or around the federal lower Snake River dams. How many survive going through the Idaho Power Hells Canyon Dam Complex? That's kind of an out there question. Todd, do you have, I don't know if you've looked at that issue, have you?
It's called a rhetorical question because the person who asked it knows the answer, which is 0, because there is no fish passage at Hells Canyon. So, the point being that people claim that removing the 4 Snake River dams will open up all this habitat, but if you go not very far, and I've actually taken, if you haven't taken a trip down Hells Canyon, it's really beautiful. You should do it. It's right along the border of Idaho and Oregon, and I've taken a trip down it. But there's a dam with no fish passage. So even if we tore down the dams, there's a dam not far away from that, which would prevent salmon from getting farther up the Snake.
Wasn't there an Idaho congressman that was trying to get rid of the lower Snake dams? Why doesn't he start with his own?
Well, that's true. Congressman Simpson has a $33.5 billion program, proposal at least, that he wants funded. As I've pointed out, that's more than 330 years worth of salmon recovery funding at current levels in the state. So we can spend, 3 centuries worth of money on just one stretch of river, or for what we do for the whole state of Washington. There is the Clearwater River. So the Clearwater, so it's sort of, there's splits at Lewiston and Clarkston and goes up the Clearwater, and there are fish that go up that way. But as that report from Idaho Fish and Game pointed out, returns on the Clearwater are supposed to be very high this year.
All right. There's one final question here. It's a little out of the ballpark. Are there any limits on factory fishing in the ocean? It's not our topic for the day, but I'm assuming, Todd?
Yeah, look, what happens in the ocean is a big issue, because what you see are the trends. The return trends are not just on the snake, right? People take this very myopic view of the snake and they say, oh, all trends up or down must be due to those 4 dams. And that is absolute nonsense. What we see is that the same sort of up and down trends that you see in the snake, you see elsewhere across the Northwest. So what happens in the ocean makes a big difference. Fishing is a big part of that. There are limits on total amount of catch. Nations negotiate the total amount of catch. There are claims that Russians and other folks are violating those rules and illegally catching more. I'm not an expert in that, but yes, there are negotiations about total allowable catch of salmon in the area by all countries.
I'm told there's a new documentary, Seaspiracy or something on Netflix that's supposed to be a must watch on that. But I'm always leery of documentaries until I know whether or not I can trust the documentarian, because you can make something look horrible by omitting the counter evidence, and so I've seen that before too.
There's a great podcast called More or Less, which for a geek like me is just fantastic, because it looks at statistical claims. So if you are really bored and can't sleep, you should go to the More or Less podcast, and it looks at statistical claims. And it did an entire podcast on Seaspiracy and looked at the claims that they made in there. And in one case, they actually said that there was a claim that the total number of fish in the ocean was going to collapse. And they asked the scientist who purportedly made that claim, and he said, no, that's not the claim I made. And even since then, I've backed off of it because I don't think it's true anymore. So I haven't seen the documentary myself, but I have looked at analysis of it, and that podcast, I think, is the best job of looking at the people who are quoted and looking at the claims and sort of determining whether they're true or not.
All right. Thanks, Todd. And thanks, Elizabeth. Thank you both for participating. And as always, for the great work that you do. I want to encourage those of you who watch today's program, make sure you share it with friends, tell others about Washington Policy on the Go. It's every other week. We also have Policy Perspectives every other Friday on Facebook. It's a Facebook Live event. So there's no registration. You just show up at noon on Friday. And hey, if you're not sure if it's the right Friday or not, you can either check out the WashingtonPolicy.org events page, or just show up on our Facebook page and see if Chris Cargill and Paul Guppy are live there. And you can check that out, like I say, every other Friday. In the meantime, we thank you for joining us today. We hope if you're not a member, you'll become a member of Washington Policy Center. And if you are a member, we hope you'll encourage your friends and family to become members of Washington Policy Center as well. We'll post this video up on YouTube. So if you have a friend who you think would find value in watching that, you can share this recording with them coming up off our YouTube channel as well. Thanks again, and have a great day.